economy technologically. And so in order to compete, jobs that used to be working in a factory, making a piece of equipment, and you worked on the piece of equipment, now there's a computer that runs that piece of equipment. You've got to know how to run the computer.
Is that a bad thing?
So it's a different, no, it's a good thing, but it means that the skill sets are accelerating, and we need workforce investment to allow people to keep up. People who are trained in another generation, we can't just throw them out. We've got to have the training there. So when the fight in Washington is, do we get rid of the Workforce Investment Act and do we cut it by 24%? That's a frustrating fight. We should be thinking, how do we do more? And the best example, I think, of doing more and doing it smarter is focusing more on the train-to-order aspect. I was at CCRI the other day when they graduated maybe 8 young folks who were trained in electrical engineering, and they've been working with National Grid. So on the day that they graduated, boom, they were going straight into their jobs at National Grid. National Grid knew about their work ethic. They knew how they performed in a real-life circumstance. It was terrific. The PACE program works very well, and I joined David in saluting Jim Langevin, because he's really, really worked hard on this with CCRI. He's been a real champion for this focused training. I think that has been the biggest gap. It's been basically, we'll give you the training, and then you go out and do it. And then on the other side of the gap, there are businesses who are saying, we need folks, but we haven't closed that gap. And the PACE program and some of the work that Jimmy's led out at CCRI, I think, are that key link. Because that will really, I mean, there is nothing more reassuring when you're taking a bet on your own advancement and investing in your own future than to see how that path actually leads to a, not just a job in general, but a specific job in a specific company that is waiting for you. That's been the gap I think we've missed. But with the folks in Washington, the Republicans particularly trying to cut the workforce investment, it's been hard to grow those elements of the program.
Mr. Riley.
I'm trying to say this in the nicest way possible in this forum. I've grown very weary of the government talk that I hear and the babble that I think is going on. Government doesn't create jobs. Your guys, all your programs for what you're producing doesn't create anything. What you do is you spend money. Rhode Islanders take their dollars, they take it to Washington, and then we try to get back as much as we send. You don't actually end ahead in this deal. And what you guys are trying to tell us is that you're going to set up programs that are going to create jobs that are going to take us out of 50th place. This sounds an awful lot like what you've been saying for a long time. Are there new programs that I don't know about? Are there? And what will take us out of 50th place? They didn't answer the question about the 50th place. I'm personally embarrassed. I'm not in Congress. I'm not in the Senate. I'm a resident of Rhode Island and a businessman. And I don't like to talk to people in other states where I have businesses. I don't like to talk to people in businesses that I own here in Rhode Island and explain why we're 50th on almost every single category. And then if they heard me saying this stuff back to them, I'd probably get hit. I mean, seriously, is anybody buying any of this? I've never hired anyone in my years of hiring, 35 years in business, from a workforce development program. Not one. What are you guys talking about? I want to start a business. I want an educated person that shows up at my door and sits for an interview. And I can talk to them about basic finance and math. Some of the failures that we have here in education in Rhode Island. I want a basically sound person to look me in the eye and say, I want to work on your business and I want you to train me. I trained everybody in all of our businesses. I didn't go to a school for training. I didn't go to a government program for training. I trained them. And I went out and got the best people possible. You guys make analogies to football teams and baseball teams. What does Bill Belichick do? He hires the best athlete possible. He puts them into his system. He gets football players, and he puts them into his system, and he figures out how to let them do the best within his system. That's what we ought to be thinking. It's a mindset. We have exactly the wrong mindset here in our congressional delegation. They think the government is going to all figure this out. You guys haven't created jobs. I have. So I would be embarrassed, absolutely embarrassed. As far as workforce development program, there is a proposal out there that I believe the Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce endorses, that updates the Workforce Development Act, and it talks about having businesses be 2/3 of the representation in terms of deciding what workforce development training actually gets done. Over the years, workforce development programs have been a mystery. The GAO can't even tell whether they're operating properly or not. We don't even know if they're effective. Year after year after year, this particular act hasn't been reauthorized since 2003. Why is that? You had 2009 and 10 when you were working on your Health Care Act. You had both Congresses.
I think, it's certainly interesting that Mr. Riley has not himself hired someone from a workforce program, and I hope people don't make judgments about public policy based on a personal experience alone. But the reality is I've had the opportunity to speak to many, many businesses who present one of the greatest challenges they have is finding individuals for positions that have the skills necessary and the cost of training those new employees to do the work. And that is an obstacle to hiring folks. There are many examples, as Senator Whitehouse just mentioned, of programs where the job training is leading to employment, stepping up, building futures, other programs where people are developing skills necessary to go into work. So this notion of that job training is not useful. It may not have been useful in your own experiences, Mr. Riley, but I can tell you from the constituents I've spoken to that a variety of different kinds of businesses have said that having access to training resources to train new employees would mean they could hire people. And of course these programs should be effective, they should be cost effective, there should be direct linkage between skills development and the jobs that are available and a really robust interaction between the two. But the notion that job training is not helpful to small businesses is just not true.
So I don't want to change the subject or continue on this theme, but have it directed more towards the impending fiscal cliff. And do you think the uncertainty that surrounds this nation around what's going to happen for the end of the year is in fact putting a damper on the recovery?
Undoubtedly. Undoubtedly.
And where do you stand? What are there particular incentives?
I think we need to
cuts that you're going to
solve it. We've put on the Democratic side, we've put $1 trillion in cuts already in the Budget Control Act. The sequester has another $1.2 trillion. That's $2 trillion in cuts that are on the table. We need to reorient the sequester, and I hope reduce it fairly considerably, but that's what's on the table. On the other side, in revenues, the country is at, I think the Providence Journal had in their editorial the other day that we're at a 60-year low in revenues and we need to add revenues. And the other side of the aisle won't put on the table
So do you think
tax
this nation
subsidies
can,
to oil.
do you think this nation can absorb a tax hike?
On the oil companies, absolutely. On the hedge fund billionaires who are paying lower tax rates than the guy who drives the package delivery truck to their door, absolutely. Getting rid of the Bush tax cuts over $250,000 saves $800 billion in the budget period that should go towards deficit reduction. We can do this. We do $1.2 trillion a year in tax spending. Over 10 years, that means you only have to get rid of 1/10 of it. The Republicans haven't put one on the table, not a nickel. And so if you're gonna take $4 trillion in cuts and have that be the way you go, the problem is, take a look at the news about Portugal. If you're gonna go an austerity route and just try to cut your way to health, look at what happens. We've seen it all over Europe. This is a demonstration in place. GDP down, unemployment up, recession worsening. It's not a good path. And when you've got revenues at essentially a multi-decade low, then having there be a revenue element in this only makes sense. We did fine under President Clinton when we last balanced the budget, and the tax rates were not onerous and didn't break the economy because guess what? The economy exploded at that time. It was our last successful budget effort until President Bush came in and just blew the doors off the deficit. We're still trying to fix that.
I'm going to go to Mr. Hinckley
I
and
keyed
Mr. Doherty.
in on a couple things. First of all, a lot of our problems go away when people get back to work. The reason we're at a historically 60-year low of tax receipts, around 15% of GDP, is because not enough people are working, and they are shackled and harnessed by a broken 4 million word tax code that hammers businesses and hammers small families. The way we get out of these problems, the way we become less reliant on the Workforce Reinvestment Act or Investment Act, is to get people working. I'll tell you about workforce investment. I hired Mike Restivo from Cumberland, Rhode Island, 21 years old, right out of college, with a lot of debt. 8 years later, he manages 15 people at my company. He owns a home. He's paid off his college loans. He's married and planning a family. That's workforce investment. This notion that the government is going to come in, take more money out of a private sector that's struggling. Let me tell you, there is no such thing as addition by subtraction. You cannot make the private sector bigger by taking money out of it and then running it through the government and redistributing it. Our economy is seriously faltering, and the government is the problem. The government can only do two things when it relates to a business. Only two things. All these programs sound wonderful. It can do two things. It can create obstacles to businesses or remove them. We live in a state, number 50, in a country, slipping, that puts more obstacles in the way of businesses every single day. And every time they pass another legislation, or propose another tax hike, further tinkering with a tax code that's already broken, that no one likes, is once again a failure of leadership, and that will bear out with the fiscal cliff we have. Again, a failure of leadership, and it boils down to the partisan fighting when you have people that vote 100% along their party leadership lines, instead of starting with something like Simpson Bulls, which President Obama, through his commission, asked for. It was completely ignored. We need a common ground starting point to solve this national crisis that is burying our nation right now.
I'm going to go to Mr. Doherty.
We know we need a balanced approach to revenues and cuts, but let's not be hypocritical. We're talking to the business community here and talking about taxing people who make over $250. We know that many of the small businesses make over $250. Those are job growers. So we need to be very careful on how we do that. I said earlier, we have 93,000 small businesses in Rhode Island. We're in tough times right now. Let's not kill some of those job growers.
I want to ask about that.
Yeah,
The $250,000.
Really, really important.
Let's
Look,
talk about that as a philosophy.
Absolutely. It is very important to recognize that every economist who has looked at the fiscal cliff in a serious way says you have to do two things. You have to cut spending and you have to generate revenues. Sheldon is absolutely right. We've already cut $1 trillion. What has been, particularly on the House side, what the House Republicans have refused to do is add $1 single to revenue by ending subsidies to big oil, by ending subsidies to big agricultural corporations, by letting tax cuts expire at the top 2%, by ending the favored treatment of carried interest. You cannot solve this problem unless you do it in a balanced way. 98% of the House Republicans took the Grover Norquist pledge, a pledge to a lobbyist, promising not to close a loophole, to raise a single dollar. They've committed to not being part of the solution. So it has to be in a balanced way. I think the president is absolutely right. $250,000 is the cutoff. It means 98% of Americans will not see a tax increase, and 97% of small businesses. You know who the job creators are? The job creators aren't the people at the top. The job creators are middle-class families who have money in their pockets, who have a job, who can buy the goods and services business produces. The strength of our economy grows from the demand of the middle class. And so there's a set of policies that have hollowed out the middle class of this country. A housing crisis, Wall Street that's run wild, tax policies that rewards people at the top. What we need to be focused on is strengthening the middle class who creates the demand for small business.
Are there some sectors of business that are good and then some sectors that are not good?
No, I'm not suggesting there's good and bad sectors. What I'm suggesting is strengthening the middle class that provides the demand for small business and protecting 97% of small business from a tax increase. We have got to generate revenues to pay down our debt. You can't, Paul Ryan proposes a budget which adds $1 trillion tax cut for the people at the very top and then has the nerve to say he's a deficit hawk. It's a joke. He endorsed all the Bush budgets and created the deficit and then gives another big tax cut for millionaires and disinvest in things that we need to grow our economy.
So
workforce training, education.
So as a small business grows and it becomes successful and hopefully to inure to the to the ownership of the business, we get up to the 250 mark, and then all of a sudden, no good, right?
Right, obviously no good. But the question was originally, I believe, about the fiscal cliff. Right. Again, a lot of government speak that end up somewhere in some other discussion. We're talking about a fiscal cliff that is tantamount to a failure by the three people who represent our congressional delegation on this panel. That is a failure that we're in this situation. And guess what? On November 6th or 7th, regardless of who wins up here, we're going to punt. That's what's going to happen. These three guys are going to punt. You two are members of the minority. You have nothing to say. And there's going to be a congressional Republican House. So it doesn't even really matter what you guys are saying about this. As regard to the fiscal cliff, the fiscal cliff is the result of failures of previous negotiations. Of course businesses are upset about it. But I'm a businessman. I know what's going to happen. You're going to go to the old playbook and you're going to punt. So I figure there's a 20% chance you punt to March 15th, and there's an 80% chance you punt to July. And there's no chance that we have the problem of the fiscal cliff. So worrying about all these things that are going to happen on January 1st is just not going to happen.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, so I just want to ask about the Fed's monetary policy, QE, the quantitative easing. Has it been successful in terms of long-term interest rates and an ability to really grow the environment?
Well, I think whoever owns the paper contract to supply paper to the Fed for printing money is doing very, very well these days. Unfortunately, seniors in Rhode Island that live on fixed incomes that have watched gas prices double, food prices skyrocket, understand firsthand the cost of printing money. We are trying to print our money out of a depression based on horrible big government policies, and I think that is definitely going to come home to roost, as it always does in every other country's history, historically speaking. When you print money, it doesn't end well. And I know they have a fancy word for it called quantitative easing, but at the end of the day, it's money printing, and it's not good for the long-term health of America or Americans.
Anyone else on the Fed policy?
Well, I'll say this, that where unfortunately Congress hasn't been able to come together in a bipartisan way, which we should be able to do to fix our financial problems. At least the Fed has tried to act within the tools, within its toolbox, its capabilities to act, and they've done that with QE 1, 2, and 3 that have at least kept long-term interest rates very low, and it's allowed some people to refinance, or especially for those people that are looking to buy a home right now, it's a unique opportunity. But obviously the interest rates are not going to stay low forever, and I'm hopeful that within that time frame in the near future, we are going to be able to get our fiscal house in order. I do believe personally that when the Congress comes back into session, and I do believe President Obama is going to be reelected, that the budget negotiations between Speaker Boehner and the President, where we almost had a $4.5 trillion balanced approach to getting a fiscal house will be resurrected, whether it's some goals or the near deal that the President and Speaker almost came up with. No one wants to see sequestration go into effect, because it's the worst way to budget. You're treating your top priorities the same as your lowest priority, so it's a stupid way to budget. But the bottom line is it's going to come down to a balanced approach with revenues on the table, and yes, strategic budget cutting, that we're not just cutting for the sake of cutting, that we're actually cutting programs that aren't working, but we're spending, we're going to get a return on investment, whether it's job training or it's infrastructure. These are the things that we need to invest in. But at least the Fed has tried to act, to do something within its capabilities, and I believe that, at least for a time, the short-term interest rates are helping both business and families.
Okay, we have just a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to offer your final words of wisdom and parting shots, and take on anything that you heard this morning that you'd like to take issue with. So I will start with Congressman Cincinnati.
Thank you again to the Chamber for doing this. I've served for the last 2 years on the Small Business Committee in the House, and we focused on both regulatory reform in a bipartisan way with the repeal of 1099, looked at issues of SBIR and access to capital. I think we all recognize that small business is the engine of Rhode Island's economy, and we have to be looking at all the things we discussed today in terms of regulatory reform, permitting process reform, workforce training, all that. But I think part of our economic strategy has to also recognize that we have got to rebuild the middle class in this country. And the policies that the President has put forth, that we've been fighting for, Jim and I, are about strengthening the middle class, investing in innovation, education, small business, the things that are infrastructure, the things that are really necessary to grow and strengthen and rebuild the middle class of this country. That's a strategy for helping to grow small business, because that's where the demand for the products that small business produces. When you go to a small business and you say, what do you need to grow jobs? The answer I get over and over again is, I need customers. I need people to buy the stuff I make and sell. That's what the middle class of this country does. And so if we focus on looking at this through the lens of middle class families, what do we do to strengthen them, to protect them, to grow the middle class, we'll grow our economy.
Mr. Doherty.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here, Lori, and I want to thank the folks from Fidelity and the Chamber of Commerce. You know, I'm proud of my support from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, because they understand that I get it. It's about jobs and the economy. We need to grow jobs in America. We need to grow jobs right here on Rhode Island. It's shameful that we have the second highest unemployment rate in the United States of America. We can do better than this. We must do better than this. For the next generation, we have a responsibility to correct this. So it comes down to leadership. And leadership's not about ranks and privileges and titles. Leadership's about taking responsibility for what happens on your watch and doing whatever you can to drive jobs back to Rhode Island and to America. You know, I've heard some statistics up here. It reminds me of an old saying that the figures don't lie, liars figure. Let me throw a statistic out for you. 70% of manufacturers pay taxes at an individual rate. I'm here to support the businesses of the state of Rhode Island. Thank you for having me.
You know, times are tough, and unfortunately, our federal government has spent about $5 trillion that they had to borrow from China and our children over the last 4 years. To put that into perspective, we spent $350 billion when a billion actually meant something. Remember that, when a billion was a lot of money? They throw these trillions around like it's chump change. We spent $350 billion to fight World War II. No one could believe how much money that was at the time. We borrowed it from within. That money, 1942 dollars adjusted for inflation, equals about $4.8 trillion. About the same that these folks, these career politicians in Washington, D.C. have borrowed from our children. I ask you to look around outside. Do you see World War II type progress for the amount of money they've leveraged against our children's future? I'd love to put this into perspective for you. 1 trillion seconds, just one, is almost 32,000 years. That's what they are doing to our children. I am a father and I'm a businessman. That is the sum of my life in my adult years. I'm not a D or an R. I'm a father, a businessman, and a Rhode Islander that cares about his state and cares about his country. And let me tell you, the definition of insanity is electing the same people over and over again and expecting a different result. We need new faces to solve the problems that the last generation of career politicians have left us. And we're not going to do it by doing the same things. We need to get the government out of the way and put the entrepreneur and small business men and women back in the driver's seat.
Senator
Lori, let
Whitehouse.
me join everybody in thanking you and thanking the Chamber of Commerce for hosting all of this. I spent a lot of time listening to businesses in Rhode Island, folks who come to my community dinners, folks who I see on my small business tours, folks who I visit when I go to factory floors. And it is absolutely clear that jobs and economic development remains a vital issue. It is also pretty clear to me that for many businesses there are in fact government programs that really do help. They help stem the countercyclical wash of boom and bust, and they help focus where there are gaps on the private market. Michael Black would not have national marker in this state if it weren't for the Small Business Administration, because there was a period when you simply couldn't get a loan from the private sector. So being smart about this and supporting those programs that are really creating jobs and helping us get out of the meltdown from that economic recession is vitally important. It's also vitally important that we not allow this discussion to hold a gun to our head for other purposes. So, for instance, folks who want to cut and voucherize Medicare are using this occasion to try to generate leverage to do that kind of damage to Medicare. I think that's dead wrong. That's, for me, a red line. I think folks want to push, there are folks who want to push Social Security into this discussion. It's got a $2.7 trillion surplus. They want to push it in this discussion. I think that's another place where we need to stand and fight. There is no private program that is going to support a kid who needs a Pell Grant. A kid who needs a Pell Grant comes from a family that doesn't have a lot of resources. And it's a piece in paying for college education. I think Pell Grants are absolutely vital to fight for. So we have to have this discussion. It has to be solved in a balanced and reasonable way. We cannot austerity cliff our way out of the sequester. And we also have to make sure that we don't take the core pillars of the American middle class and kick them out from under the middle class, because there's a group in Washington that wants to hold this issue hostage to get those things done, things that the American public doesn't want. So I intend to be a very strong advocate for Rhode Island in those fights, and I look forward to continuing to serve and continuing to represent Rhode Island for those critical purposes, jobs and protecting the core pillars of the middle class.
Mr. Riley.
Thank you for having me as well, and thank all of you for attending. I know that you're probably hearing my words by the end of this discussion. What I have to say touches on a number of things here. First of all, when you talk about Southern Europe and austerity, let's remember there's two parts to that. What they've been forced to do, because they spent so much money, more much money than they had, is to cut spending and raise taxes. That's what austerity is in Southern Europe. That's why you see rioting. Okay? So it's obviously not the right idea to cut spending and raise taxes. So that shouldn't be part of the discussion. I don't have raising taxes as part of my program. My idea is to simplify the tax code. Take 77,000 pages of the tax code down to 100 and lower the overall tax rates to maybe even a flat tax, or make it just simple 2 or 3 brackets. Take everything, including subsidies to oil companies, completely out. So don't hold that over me. The pledge to Grover Norquist, I refuse to sign that pledge. Why? Because I want to be flexible. I want to go down and be able to negotiate at my fullest. That's what I've done all my life. That's what I intend to do in Washington. All of this talk about is people are holding you back from what you want to do is unsatisfactory to me. I have a great idea about what to do. I want to grow the economy. And one of the points that we're looking at is the Federal Reserve policy. We have a Federal Reserve that is completely out of control. Why? Because our fiscal policy stinks and our government isn't working. And we haven't passed a budget in 4 years. All things that have to do with you gentlemen up here. If I go down to Congress, one of the first things that I'll say is if we don't pass a budget, we don't get paid. You guys all agree with that one?
I'm a co-sponsor of the bill.
Excellent. None of us will get paid. None of us will get paid. Let's pass a budget immediately. Now, with regard to Federal Reserve policy, one thing that you didn't mention, in 2008, TARP had a thing called interest on reserves. It was yet another tool we handed to the Federal Reserve. My discussion regarding interest on reserves was picked up by the Washington Post as being one of the 13th most innovative ideas in the United States. I'm thinking in different ways than these people are thinking. I'm thinking about growth. I'm thinking about taking the national economy and supporting it. To do that, we need to have a stable dollar. To have a stable dollar, we need to have a Federal Reserve that is not out of control, that is rules-based. That is within the power of Congress to set the mandates of the Federal Reserve. Once we have a simplified tax code and a stable dollar, and we cut into this regulatory nightmare that we have in Congress, we are going to be in a position where the United States economy will grow. And that will create jobs. And that will lift Rhode Island. Because Rhode Island isn't going to have a miracle on its own. Rhode Island is a canary in the coal mine. We're last in everything because our policies that have largely been the part of some of these people who have been government their entire lives, both here in Rhode Island and in the national government, have failed. And they have failed miserably. I want to try something new. Let me grow the federal economy. Let me help lift Rhode Island.
Mr. Langevin, you